It's always good to be here and spending some time with you all. For those of you who are joining us through our YouTube and Facebook platforms, welcome. And today we are starting our Suicide Prevention Day workshop. As with all our talks, all our workshops, we start with a text to harmonize ourselves and to bring us together to our core. And I want to remind you all that I'm monitoring both YouTube and Facebook, so if you do have any comments throughout the day, any questions, just bring it to us and we'll try to address them. So starting with a text from the book Our Daily Bread by our dear Francisco Cândido Xavier through the Spirit Emmanuel. It's chapter 31 and entitled With Charity. Talking about a passage from Paul in the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 16, verse 14. When Paul said, "Let all your affairs be done with charity." There are still many who do not understand any other sort of charity than the one that dresses humbly on Saturdays and Sundays in order to distribute a little bread to those down on their luck, or a charity that waits for a public calamity to happen before it manifests itself, or one that publishes moving appeals in printed materials. We cannot question the praiseworthy intentions of this or that group. However, we must realize that the sublime gift of charity is sublime in its reach. Paul indicates that charity, the kind that expresses Christian love, must embrace all the various activities of our life. To extend a helping hand and to distribute consolation is to begin the practice of the sublime virtue. All the potentialities of the Spirit, however, must eventually be aligned with the divine precept of charity, because there's charity in speaking and in listening, in preventing and in allowing, in forgetting and in remembering. A time will come when the mouth, the ears, the feet will be allies of fraternal hands in serving the supreme good. Each person, like each thing, needs the contribution of goodness in some particular way. Those who lead or those who obey need its holy cooperation in order to be enlightened in the sector they occupy in God's house. Without sublimated love, there will always be darkness, which creates complications. From now on, carry out your smallest tasks with charity, even though you may not find direct spiritual recompense. In the realm of understanding, you can be sure that the Father devotedly follows all of his children. Are there rocks and thorns? Set your thoughts in Jesus and press on. May us bow, take a deep breath in prayer. With these beautiful words from Emmanuel, these beautiful words from Paul, talking to us, reaching our inner soul about charity, talking about how charity can be in all of our actions, in our speaking, in our listening, in our remembering and our forgetting. Now, we elevate our thoughts into the one who led Paul. We elevate our thoughts into Jesus, our example, our model and guide, who still to this day inspires us on how to be good. How to not only understand and know about charity, but how to act it in every single movement of our bodies, of our eyes, of our smiles. God, may your light, may your divine love reach our hearts, reach our souls, so we can start to exercise charity more and more, starting with our own selves, especially when talking about suicide today. Help us detect that within us, any thoughts, ideas, plans, and also help us detect in others, so we can all, in a fraternal society, grow as a whole, reaching the level of repair, resurrection, that we will in the next stage of our planet Earth that you so lovingly gave to us. Please illuminate our day, illuminate our words, our thoughts, our reflection, and our hearts. So be it. So thank you all again for showing up virtually. Welcome, Malcolm. Great to see you here today. And again, an invitation to all of you joining us on Facebook or YouTube. Please put your comments, your questions, your thoughts on the live chat, and we'll monitor it and hopefully address them as we go. So we will, this is the agenda for the day. We'll start today now at 10 o'clock. We'll end at 4. We'll have 5 talks. First, talking about suicide from a numbers perspective, which is the one we'll be doing right now. Then we'll move on to talk about the suicides from a conscious and a subconscious perspective with Renata. Then we'll break for lunch, and at 1 o'clock we'll come back and talk about mental health and spiritual health and how that impacts suicide with our dear friend Louise. Then at 2 o'clock we'll talk about the consequences of suicide. How will be the life after our incarnated life with our dear friend Sonia. And lastly, to finish, but certainly not least, Fraternity, the warming shelter for the soul with our dear friend Eric. And then we'll finalize with a final prayer, and we should be wrapped up by 4 o'clock. So you can stop and go at every time we have a new lecture or have a new talk. We'll issue it on WhatsApp just to remind you that we're starting a new one. With these workshops, we like to invite you all to follow our YouTube channel in case you can't see it today, or if you want to repeat again sometime in the future. If you follow our Fraternity Spiritist Society of Calgary page on YouTube, it has all our videos, all our lectures, all our workshops, our Cherishing Life workshops. And we're creating some playlists here to bundle all the talks. And our workshop this today is talking about Suicide Prevention Day. And as it is part of our Cherishing Life workshops, where the focus is to cherish life, right? To embrace life, to see how much it is worth it and how it is part of our evolvement. As there's always a reason for us to be here. Good morning, Carol. Good to see you here too. So today we'll be talking about suicide the entire day, to follow along with the month of suicide by the World Health Organization. And our talk right now will be on numbers. And I particularly like numbers. And we like starting with numbers to basically level our playing field, to make sure that we're all on the same page that we understand some of the facts, some of the numbers from our society. A lot of times we might not know what's happening out there, so it's good for us to understand where we sit, where we lie. And from there, hopefully we can bring some reflections and some interpretations of those numbers. So I want to start by what Renata actually started the same talk last year by a Chinese philosopher, Zhang Tzu, who said this 4 centuries before Christ. He said, "Birth is not a beginning, death is not an end." Just to show that this idea that birth is not the beginning and death is not the end of this spirit that lives on after the body passes or perishes, it is not something that Spiritism brought. It's something that has been around for many centuries, many millennia. And with an invitation for today, I resort to Kardec's words in his conference in Bordeaux. And it's recorded in the book Spiritist Journey, where he said, "Consoling those who suffer, uplifting the courage of the depressed, relieving men from their passions, from their distress, from suicide. Perhaps stop them from the abyss of crime." So this is an invitation to all of us. Within ourselves, so we can hopefully within ourselves console our own suffering, uplift our courage when we're depressed, and hopefully stop us from committing suicide. Or with others as well, right? Can we identify that in others, and how can we help? How can we bring that consolation, utilizing what our greatest consoler always has taught us, our good friend and brother Jesus, consoling others with his invitation to follow his steps. So let's start with numbers then. Starting with the globe. We'll look at suicide from a global perspective, and then we'll trickle down to focus more on Canada and then even our province here, Alberta. So this is how we look at the suicide rate around the globe. Again, these are numbers from 2016, this infograph here. And we're looking at a rate of numbers of suicide per 100,000 people, right? And we can see that Canada lies between the 10 to 15 deaths for every 100,000. And Brazil actually is lower at roughly 6 to 7. And to bring this map into real numbers that we can relate to, this means that close to 800,000 people die of suicide every year. To bring this to something more understandable, that means 1 death for every 40 seconds. So I have been talking here for roughly 14 minutes. So since you've dialed in, there has been at least, it's tough to do math right now, but roughly 30 or so people that have committed suicide since I started talking around the globe, just to bring this to perspective, right? And as far as the age range, we're looking at our youth here from 15 to 29-year-olds. That is the second leading cause of death, committing suicide. So it is quite devastating amongst those of us who are in that range. And when we look at income, we can see that 79% of suicides happen in low to mid-income countries, whereas 21% happen in the high-income countries. And when we want to put those into perspective as far as progression goes, right? So we talked about static numbers from 2016, but how about we look at a progression, right? How has suicide rates progressed with time, right? So we're going to see from 1990 to 2017, and here is split between regions around the world, and we have here again rates per 100,000, and we can see that again North America ranges around that 12 to 13 people committing suicide for every 100,000, and we have Eastern Europe and Oceania as being the highest regions of the world with suicide in 1990. So now we'll see an overlay with 2017, and you can see that there is a drop. Every blue that you see there, that's how much we've decreased the rate of suicide around the globe. Right? So that's some good news, right? Especially in Western Europe and Oceania, we can see they were able to manage suicide and decrease it by quite a bit in some areas. That's not to say that there isn't more work to do. Certainly we hope that this actually comes down to zero. But one thing that I wanted to point out is that in North America, you don't see any blue there, right? That's because it actually didn't decrease. It marginally increased in North America being Canada and the States. We went from 12.2 people for every 100,000 to 12.6. So in the past 27 years, we actually increased a little bit our rate of suicide. So again, brings us an idea of where we are and how important this is, right? How important it is to talk about it. And if we look at causes of death around the globe, suicide is the 15th cause of death around the globe. Then we'll see the stats around Canada, which is a little bit different. But cardiovascular diseases, again, being the leading cause, with taking roughly 18 million lives every year. And suicide, 15th cause, with around 800,000, as you can see there. I'll be pointing to the screen a lot today because I noticed that you guys can't see our pointers online, so I'll be using my hands, so bear with me here. And so it is the 15th cause with roughly 800,000, as we chatted about before. This talk, I'll be breaking it, giving us a little bit of a break from numbers. So we'll talk about numbers a little bit, then we'll take a break and do some reflections, then go back to numbers and do some reflections, just so I'm not talking about numbers for 40 minutes straight. And so we'll start by asking ourselves, why do we commit suicide? I mean, why do we get to that point? And here we'll see some passages from the book called Suicide False Solution from our dear friend Alirio Cerqueira Filho from the Federation, or Spiritist Federation from the state of Mato Grosso in Brazil. And our dear friend Eric has shared with us about it on YouTube and on Facebook, on Facebook, my bad. He has shared that book, Suicide False Solution. He included the audiobook if you are wanting to see it. It's also on YouTube as well, which is what we'll see now. We'll see some passages from that book that's on the live chat here. So Alirio describes that we commit suicide for many different reasons, right? And we'll highlight roughly 8 of them. For example, when we see suicide as an attempt to get rid of a situation of extreme suffering, for which we think there's no solution. So when we're faced with something that we simply can't find that light at the end of the tunnel, we can't find a solution, we mistakenly think suicide is a solution, right? And that book, the title of the book is really good because it says Suicide False Solution, right? A lot of us think suicide is a solution to end that pain, that suffering, but as we'll talk about today, we'll see that suicide is actually not a solution. He says that because they are in a psychotic state, which includes obsessive induction, right? So psychotic state where the person can no longer discern what's right, what's wrong, can no longer calm down, can no longer think straight, right? Which also can be due to an induction from a spiritual obsession, right? The obsession won't actually physically make you commit suicide, but it can certainly induce you to get there throughout a period of time. So there are other factors as well. We'll see also that because they think they're being persecuted with no way out, right? And this is true from, again, the spiritual realm, if you will, from obsessions, but also from the material world, right? A lot of times we think, as an example about the law, right? If I am being persecuted and I think there's no way out, I'm in too deep of a mess and I don't think I can get out, I might resort to suicide, right? Thinking that's a solution, but again, we'll see that it isn't in this case. Because they think they're depressed, they think life is not worth it, right? So depending on how deep and that depression is, it might induce us to think there is no more meaning, that life is simply not worth it anymore, right? We're so disconnected from our own selves that we simply think that life is not worth it, right? It's that emptiness that we feel inside and we just want to end it. Because they're physical, incurable diseases and they feel hopeless, right? So a lot of times we have incurable diseases or physical disabilities that causes whatever it is, be it pain, be it distress, and with the hope to end that suffering, we commit suicide. But again, we'll see that's not the avenue that we are invited to take. And then a lot of times too, because of boredom or a materialistic conception regarding life. Right? When we're so ingrained in materialism, we disconnect with the meaning of life. We disconnect from God. So we start to lose the sense of purpose. We don't see the purpose in life anymore. And we decide to end it, right? Thinking that we can. And then he also brings about the idea that in order to be united to a loved one who disincarnated. So for those of us who have the understanding that there is an afterlife, right, the spirit lives on. A significant other passed away, and then wanting to reunite with her or with them, some people do commit suicide, as we'll see later on. And again, because they suffer from personality disorder, attempting against their own lives in an impulse of anger or to call attention. Right, so again, a personality disorder, not being able to think clearly, we attempt against our own lives, be it in an impulse of anger or hatred, or also in an impulse to cause harm to other people, to try and call attention to our own selves. So again, this is from that book, Suicide, False Solution by Alida Sirkera-Filho. And I want to remind everybody that we have shared that on YouTube and on our Facebook live chats. And Anna, great to see you here. Welcome. And let's keep going. So what do all suicides have in common after they kill themselves? Right, so what happens after? Right? And Sonia will talk a lot more about this today. Complete disappointment. Once the spirit, after they commit suicide, they get to a state of complete disappointment. And the reason being that we cannot die. We simply cannot die. We might try by committing suicide, but we can't actually kill our spirit. We live on. Our conscience lives on. Our feelings lives on. And this is not something about spiritism. This is something seen in a lot of religions, in a lot of philosophies and so on. So, and even with professional scientists, we are seeing more and more them talking about this afterlife and this complete disappointment that we feel after suicide. So we did a few reflections. Now let's go back to numbers, because again, after all, this is a numbers talk. And we talked about global. Now let's come a little bit closer and talk about Canada. So these are numbers from 2018. And when we're looking at deaths and hospitalizations, we see that every single day in Canada, 11 people commit suicide. Every day. So throughout this workshop, we're talking about roughly 6 hours of workshop. In those 6 hours, there will be 3 people dying from suicide. 3 people committing suicide within these 6 hours, when a day has 24. Just like with the global stats, we see that amongst our youth and young adults, so 14 to 34 years, that is the second leading cause of death. And in Canada, every year we have an average of 4,000 deaths. And 90+% of those that commit suicide were living with a mental health problem or a mental health illness. So suicide is that end, or it's that consequence, if you will, that action at the end, but the whole underlying cause is certainly what we can reach, is certainly what we can help with. It's where we can stop suicide, is by also talking about that underlying cause, which in most cases is mental health. And for that reason, we will have a mental health talk today with Louise after lunch. And again, when we look at the leading causes of death within Canada, cancer being the first one, suicide is the 9th, with roughly, again, around 4,000 people. When we're talking gender, comparing males to females, that's an interesting figure that I thought that I didn't know. So men actually commit suicide 3 times more than women. So for every woman that committed suicide, 3 men have committed suicide here in Canada. So when we're talking numbers, we can see the rate of, again, 100,000 people. You can see females in blue and males in brown. So you can see that a lot of times the brown is 3 times higher than females. And these are the death rates. So the suicide that actually not only attempt, but they actually completed, if you will, the suicide. They actually, their body actually died. Now, the interesting part about this is then when we look at hospitalizations by self-injury, so people that attempted to commit suicide, that is a lot higher in females than males. And this brings us to the statistic that females actually attempt suicide more than men. But the means and the ways that females utilize to try and commit suicide are not as, let's say, effective as men. So luckily women, even though they try more, they don't actually complete that suicide, if you will, so they don't commit it, they don't die. Whereas men, they resort to means a little bit more aggressive that actually complete, and they do end up committing suicide and then dying. So since we started talking about planning and attempting suicides, there's a good infographic here talking about thoughts, plans, and attempts, right? So everything starts with a thought, and then a lot of times we plan it, and then eventually we actually attempt, right? So in Canada, again, 2018, we had almost 12% of people reported having thoughts of suicide within their lifetime. And I want to bring an example of, for example, a movie theater. If there's 200 people in that movie theater with you, that's not high attendance, maybe that's COVID numbers, but if you will, if there's 200 people in that movie theater with you, that means that 24 people in that movie theater have thought of suicide in their lifetimes. 2.5 report actually having suicidal thoughts in the past year. So again, in that same movie theater, 5 of them have thought about suicide just in the past year. Now, when we resort to plans, right, so people not only thought, but they actually planned to commit suicide, 4% they report having actually planned a suicide within their lifetime. So again, going back to that movie theater with 200 people, that means that we have 8 people out of those that actually planned a suicide. And we can see the higher incidence of planning a suicide in our low income quintile families when we compare that to the highest. So there is a larger incidence of planning with our lower income community. And then actual attempts. So these are people who actually not only planned it, but actually attempt to commit suicide. And 3.1% report having made a suicide attempt in their lifetime. So when we're looking at that movie theater, 6 people in that movie theater actually tried it. They actually tried to commit suicide. And an interesting point that Renata brought to us last year, and I think it's important to bring it again, especially when talking about Canada, the incidence of suicide is 3 times higher in Canadian-born than in people who immigrated into Canada. The message from that infographic at the very end is that there's hope. Suicide can be prevented. As we talked about, suicide is that action at the end, but there's a whole underlying cause that can be treated because help is out there, right? We are not alone, right? None of us is immune to it. So it's really important to understand that we are all vulnerable. It could happen to any of us. So identifying those thoughts, those ideas when they're premature is very important within ourselves and with our community. So there is hope. It can be prevented. We live in a country that actually has quite a bit of resources for us. And we'll see a little bit more about it. Let's talk Alberta now then. So we've talked globally, Canada, and now let's dig a little bit deeper and talk Alberta, our own province. So here there's a distribution of rates of suicide across Canada. And we can see the average of the country is around roughly 10 suicides every 100,000 people, right? And because we have roughly 37 to 40 million people in Canada, that equates to those 4,000 people every year. So I'm bringing this graph for 2 reasons. First is the Alberta there, to realize that our province here, where we are, actually is above the national rate. So in Alberta, there's more people committing suicide than the average of our country. And also to bring us, again, the importance of talking about those provinces and those territories that the majority are Indigenous people and First Nations. So they certainly have a higher incidence of suicides, especially when compared to the other parts of our country. So again, to bring us the awareness and what is our role in that. And there is an association, a Canadian association called, it's a non-for-profit called the Canadian Mental Health Association, and it spans across Canada, and it has also different branches to deal with different aspects of mental health. And suicide is one of their branches called the Center of Suicide Prevention, and we'll see some stats that they've provided us, specifically about Alberta. So they said the bad news is that globally more people die by suicide than in war and homicide combined. And in our province here, every year over 500 Albertans die that end up committing suicide. That's more than people dying in traffic collisions. Almost double. Now the good news is, there's always the good news, is that suicide is preventable. Right? If we're able to identify it in the beginning, it's something that we can help in. We can talk, we can reach out and get help. And this number was interesting, that last year the Canadian Mental Health Association intervened with 1,900 suicidal Albertans, not Canada, just our province here. 1,900 people that were thinking about suicide didn't go through with it because they talked to this association. Out of those 1,900 that they stopped, 1,200 of them were phone intervened. With a phone call, they were able to intervene a person from committing suicide. So there are many ways that we can be intervened, and it could be as simple as a phone call. So help could be a phone call away. And another number from this that I was surprised to hear, and we'll reflect a little bit more about this later on, is that only 1 out of 3 people who attempt or die by suicide actually go through their health system. So that means that 66% of people that attempt or plan a suicide don't go see a doctor, don't go to the hospital. So that just brings us the importance of doing this that we're doing here, right? To inform our community, to inform everybody of how important the community, the family, our own reflections is when talking about suicide, because 66% of us don't actually resort to help from our health system. So, stopping a little bit on the numbers now and chatting about some reflections, bringing some spiritist information, if you will, about how the spirit lives on. We can see that through trustworthy mediums, good superior spirits have given us detailed accounts of what happens to their moral spirit once we leave the flesh. These testimonies describe different causes of death, including death by suicide. And all these spirits, at different times, through different mediums, they would all report the same thing. They would all say that instead of putting an end to their suffering, what suicides, people who committed suicide, have to face is utter disappointment. Because not only do they have not died, but they also have increased their suffering substantially. On top of their original problems, they now have to deal with the repercussion of their unfortunate actions. Right? So again, bringing that idea that suicide is a false solution. It is not the solution to end our suffering. And we will end this talk further down talking about the divine mercy, divine God, how He is always there for us. His love is certainly infinite, and His mercy is always there for us to help us deal with whatever we're going through, so we don't have to actually commit suicide. So, because we are going through a pandemic, and there are some studies out there talking about the pandemic and how that might affect suicide, I thought it'd be important to also bring a little bit of COVID-19. And since we are still going through this pandemic, there are no real numbers. Most of it is predictions, but certainly something that can help us understand what we're going through and what we might go through in the near future. So again, that Canadian Mental Health Association, they have conducted a survey about a month ago where they interviewed people and asked them if they had any suicidal thoughts since the pandemic broke out, so since February, March, right? So in the past 5 or so months. And they reported that 1 in 5 people who already had a mental illness or mental health issues have thought about suicide in the past 5 months since the pandemic struck. Right? That was the highest incidence, so 1 in 5. Then 1 in 6 for Indigenous people have thought about suicide in the past, since the COVID-19 struck. As far as people with disability, that was 1 in 7. They also thought about suicide. And that's the same number also with people who identify themselves as LGBTQ plus community. And lastly, 1 in 10 parents of kids under the age of 18. So this number here struck me because it brings us also the idea that suicide, yes, committing suicide has a lot of repercussions within ourselves, but then thinking about the repercussions to others as well. Right? If 1 in 10 parents have considered or thought about suicide in the past 5 months, thinking about what would happen to those kids as well, we can see that the repercussions are actually quite longer than what we might anticipate. Again, bringing that idea that knowing this only helps us go deep inside, reflect if we are having it or if we're not. Is there anybody around us that might, and how can we help? And there is a study performed by the University of Toronto, and I'll explain this graph, it looks a little hard to understand. But basically there was a study conducted by the University of Toronto. They've published an article on the psychiatric research paper talking about the correlation they found between unemployment rate and suicide rate in an attempt to predict how would the pandemic impact our suicide rate. And through their analysis of history of suicide and unemployment rate, they realized that in a moderate case, so when they estimated that unemployment rate would hover around 7 to 8% in Canada in 2020 and 2021, they predict an extra 418 people committing suicide in the next 2 years. So our rate would increase by 5%. And in the extreme case that they looked at, so when unemployment rate reaches 16 and 15% in 2020 and 2021, the number of additional suicides that our country might be facing is in the realm of 2,200 extra people committing suicide in the next 2 years. That would be a bump, an increase in 28% of suicide in Canada alone. So this brings us the idea that a suicide could increase. So again, bringing us the importance of that awareness, be it with myself or within our community. And this is a great segue to talk a little bit about mental health and bring a little bit of numbers. Because as we talked about before, suicide is that action that we do at the end, is usually the consequence, but what is the underlying cause? What's driving us to get there? So there was a study conducted by the University of Oxford. It's actually a great website called Our World in Data, which is an initiative by Oxford University in the UK. And they've studied cases of suicide and people with mental health issues, and they found that there is a relative risk between suicide and mental health. They said that people that are undergoing through major depression, they can be 20 times more likely to commit suicide. Schizophrenia, alcohol dependence, and so on and so forth. So those are the numbers of how more likely are you to commit suicide if we're going through depression, alcohol dependence, bipolar, anxiety disorders, and so on and so forth. So again, What is the underlying cause? Can we see any signs of those within us and within our friends, and realizing that there is a solution, right? There is people out there that can help us when going through this. And now, exploding this to a global perspective, since Louise will touch upon mental health, it's important for us to note that mental health around the globe, we have reported from 2017 that roughly 800 million people do go through a mental health situation, be it depression, anxiety, bipolar, eating disorder, schizophrenia, and so on and so forth. So these are the numbers reported. Mental health is something that a lot of people don't report it. They actually don't seek for help. So this number might be much lower than what the actual number is. And what is interesting to note is that out of all mental health aspects, depression and anxiety are the leading causes of mental health. And looking at roughly 260 million people with depression around the globe and 284 with anxiety. And also important to note that females actually, depending on which one, they might be double the amount of males, especially for depression and anxiety. And eating disorders, you can see that the incidence in females be higher. And lastly, last numbers, I promise. I found this infographic talking about mental health and substance abuse, because the World Health Organization do combine them, or used to combine them in this infographic. In Canada, we're looking at 15.5% of our population having a mental health issue or having a substance abuse. And in Brazil, we're looking at 14.5%, the States 17.3%, and lastly, Oceania being one of the highest incidences in the world for mental health and substance abuse at 18.5%. So again, understanding a little bit more about mental health, which as we could see, are much more likely to induce or to lead a person to commit suicide. So looking at those warning signs is really important. You know, this might be very doom and gloom. So understanding that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Right? We're now getting to the end of our presentation today, and I wanted to talk about the light at the end of the tunnel, or at the end of this beautiful fjord or ocean that we can see here. And that is, to many of us, the divine providence. It is the divine light that is always with us, because the divine providence, the divine mercy, never abandons us. We might, but God never does. God always will love us, and His mercy will always give us the tools that we need to overcome whatever it is that we're going through, be it through family, be it through health practitioners, be it with the community, be it with a spiritist center, right? Especially when we're seeking that reconnection to God, that sometimes it's tough for us to get, right? When Paul told the Romans in chapter 5, he said, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts, right? We were created by Him. He is our Father. So He does love us, and His love is within our hearts. A lot of times it might be tough to find it, but if at least we know it's there, we will know that the journey to find it won't be wasted, because we know for sure He's there with us. His love is within us. And bringing back just one more number, I apologize. Just bringing back that striking sentence that I found, how 66% of people who attempt or actually commit suicide will not enter the health system. So 66% of people don't go seek for doctors and for hospitals, that brings us the importance of our self-awareness, of our family, and of our community, right? And we'll chat a little bit about all three. So first one being the importance of our self-awareness. The importance of going within. Right? The importance of the reflection within our own selves. The understanding that what we're going through is an opportunity for us to learn. Facing it with that feeling of apprentice. Not the feeling that I need to be a superhero, but the feeling of an apprentice. The feeling that I can be vulnerable, that I am vulnerable, because after all, I am here on earth in a trial and expiation planet for that reason. Right? For utilize God's mercy to learn. And through that learning to improve ourselves. Right? Seeing the things that we go through as means of improvement. And the self-reflection, it greatly helps us identify those things that we talked about today and the things that we'll talk about throughout our workshop today. Seeing within us, do I have any thoughts, or do I have any incidences of a mental health issue coming about, right? And if there is, we saw how common that is. And hopefully that helps us and or dissolve that stigma around it, right? If we have it, we can accept that we have it and see it with that feeling of an apprentice, right? Accepting that we have it and seeing that we have the potential to overcome it, right? Especially when we were having a tough time reconnecting with God, reconnecting with Jesus, which are great resources within our own selves, within our hearts, that can certainly help us go through that. So the role of the Spiritist Center, for example, is instrumental in helping us there, right? Helping us reconnect with God, with Jesus, with our guardian angels, right? So the self-reflection here is truly important, and for two things, right? For us, right? Detecting those feelings, those thoughts within ourselves, but also on others, right? The exercise of self-awareness, true self-awareness, helps us tremendously with understanding others, with being aware of others. What are some behaviors, what are some actions that could be indicative of a person having suicidal thoughts or having mental health issues, so we can help, right? So being able to see that on others is truly important as well. Sometimes our friends might not even know they're going through something, but we can certainly help if we are in a place to help. Remembering that none of us is also immune to it, right? We're talking here, we usually utilize the word us because we are not immune to it. Even though if I don't have it today, I could have it tomorrow, I might have had in the past. So that doesn't exclude anybody. And we certainly can feel the community as a whole, because we might all have gone through it, we might go through it at some point. So there is no taboos when talking about it. And then we move on to the family, right? So we talked about self-awareness, so the importance of our own reflections, but then also the importance of the family. Understanding that the resignation, the apprentice feeling that allows us to accept what we're going through also allows us to ask for help, right? Resort to our families and their role in helping us. It is good to point out that a lot of us might not have a family, or a lot of us might not have a family that could help us, but it is always important to understand that we all of us have a spiritual family. We all have people in this spiritual world who do love us and who want the best for us. So we do also have a spiritual family. And again, for us and for others, right? If I'm going through something, asking for help within my family, at the same time, if I'm not going through something, can I identify that in somebody within my family? Right? Sometimes family are very close, so we might take it for granted, but it's really important to understand that everybody's vulnerable, and how can we help if we're able to detect it, able to notice someone that we love going through it. And lastly, our community. Right? We all live in a community. Most of us have friends and have work friends and whatever it may be. We are all in a community. And after looking at these numbers, we realize that we're not immune. There are many around us, including ourselves sometimes, that have gone through it, or going through it, or might go through it. So talking about it, dissolving that stigma, is certainly a great first step to seek for help and to grow, right? Understanding that the Law Society teaches us that the interaction amongst ourselves is what helps the whole world to grow, right? We wouldn't be in a society if that wasn't one of the tools that God has given us to be better, to improve. And so I want to end with an invitation to all of us that may love, be it in the sunshine of the summer or in the snow of the winter, may love be our language, the language that we use to talk to our own selves when we're reflecting, to talk to our families when we're seeking for help or offering help. And may love be the language that we talk to our community, to our friends, asking for help or offering that helping hand. Right? As we saw in the first epistle of John, he said that we have this ability to love because he first loved us. So by knowing that God loves us, we know there's always somebody out there that loves us. We can develop this love within ourselves, and we can make this love pour out onto others, onto our family, onto our friends, onto our community, and hopefully get to a stage where we're no longer going through trials and expiations, but then we're now repairing all our faults through love. As we all know, love heals literally all of it. So that ends my presentation, and I have some comments here from our dear friend Eric. Thank you for participating. He said, "My gratitude for the comforting message showing us how suicide shakes our society. I hope one day our society is open for talks like this about this mortal and painful subject." He also said, "I believe we should start now the fraternal employment counseling to help prevent suicide. It is a great opportunity to extend our help for the society to consciousness." So again, just bringing us the importance of awareness, and through awareness is where we can certainly help us and others. So it is 11 o'clock. This ends my presentation, and if you do have any more questions, you can throw them into YouTube or Facebook, and we'll look at them later. So thank you for participating, and in about 10 minutes, we'll start again with our good friend Renata talking about the conscious and subconscious when it comes to suicide. So see you all in 10 minutes. Thank you.